Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in. If you're new here, consider subscribing. It really helps keep these stories coming. And while you're here, let me know in the comments where you're listening from. Now, sit back, relax, and let's get into the story. The first thing that went wrong was the radio. Not the usual kind of wrong either. No fading signal, no dead battery, no loose handset cord banging against a dash. It was the kind of wrong that makes the hair on your forearms stand up before you even understand what you're hearing. A burst of static, then a voice that didn't belong on our net. Not civilian, not law enforcement, not any unit I'd ever shared air with. The cadence was trained, short, clipped, confident, like someone who had spent years talking into a push-to-talk. Shift left, 2 teams, bound forward. Watch the gun truck. Don't waste rounds. Then the channel went silent, like it had been cut with a knife. Sheko, I was driving the lead logistics truck in a North Carolina Army National Guard convoy on Highway 74, westbound, just past the long straight stretch that runs through the Uwharrie area. The sun was low, that late afternoon angle that turned every windshield into a mirror and every shadow into a hard edge. The air had the dry, dusty smell you get when traffic hasn't moved normally for days, and everyone's been driving the shoulders, cutting across medians, dragging debris out of the way with whatever they've got. We were not normal traffic. We were 8 vehicles, spaced out, lights down, running a tight interval like a training lane. Only this wasn't training, and the cargo we were hauling wasn't pretend. We had a flatbed with a sealed biohazard transport container strapped down like it was a bank vault, plus 2 Humvees with gun shields, an MRAP in the rear, and a pair of standard cargo trucks loaded with fuel cans, water, rations, spare tires, and everything you'd pack if you knew the highways were turning into trap lines. If you watched us from an overpass, you'd think we were moving too carefully for a convoy that owned the road. But we didn't own anything anymore. We were threading a needle through a state that had started to come apart at the seams. My name is Mason Rourke. I'm a motor transport operator by military job title and a mechanic by temperament. Before all of this, I drove heavy trucks for a county fleet and spent weekends under the hood of whatever was broken in my driveway. I joined the Guard because it was steady and because my dad wore the uniform before me. I never thought steady would mean escorting biohazard samples through a collapsing public safety system with people, infected people, taking coordinated shots at us. We were told the cargo was critical evidence, time-sensitive, and high containment. That's the kind of phrase that makes you stop asking questions, because the guys who use it are usually the ones with the authority to make your day worse if you press. But I still caught glimpses. The scientist in the back seat of the second Humvee, her hands in nitrile gloves even when she wasn't touching anything, and the hard-sided containers with hazard labels locked inside the larger sealed unit. Our convoy commander was First Lieutenant Sophia Reyes, active duty style focus in a Guard uniform. She had a map board between her knees and an old-school grease pencil in her hand, marking alternates because none of our primaries could be trusted. She rode in the lead Humvee just ahead of me, on the same frequency, checking intervals, confirming landmarks, keeping us moving like motion itself was protection. Behind her was a specialist NOAA Doc Harlan in the passenger seat. Not a doctor in the civilian sense, but our medic. The one who carried bandages, pressure dressings, and the kind of calm voice you want in your ear when everything gets ugly. He was also the only one who had the courage to crack jokes over the intercom. He'd been quieter since we picked up the cargo. In the second Humvee, tucked behind a gunner and a driver who hadn't slept in a day, sat Dr. Priya Menon, civilian, likely late 30s, hair pulled back so tight it looked painful. She had the eyes of somebody who'd watched a world-ending problem crawl out of a microscope and into the street. The plan was simple because complicated plans died on day one. Get the samples west, link up at a temporary containment site near Charlotte's outskirts, then continue toward a guarded facility that still had power and perimeter control. We were told to expect blocked lanes, stranded cars, occasional panicked civilians, and sporadic hostile contact. That last part was new language, the kind you hear when the line between law enforcement and combat is dissolved. Still, none of that prepared me for hearing an enemy voice on our net giving professional instructions. I glanced at my dash cam out of habit. A cheap civilian unit I'd bolted to the windshield months ago to protect myself from insurance claims. It blinked a small red dot recording. The camera had seen everything since the day the first emergency alerts started lighting up our phones. Back then, I'd thought it might capture some crazy traffic footage, maybe a riot, maybe storm damage. Not this. "Rourke?" Reyes said over the radio, sharp. "Confirm you heard that." "I heard it," I said, forcing my voice steady, "not ours." "No," she agreed. "All stations, radio discipline, lock down transmissions, use brevity, assume we're being monitored." The problem with "assume we're being monitored" is that it's a polite way of saying they know where you are. They know what you are. They might know what you're carrying. Highway 74 rolled ahead like a ribbon laid over pine and scrub, with occasional breaks where people had abandoned vehicles at odd angles. Doors open, trunks up, as if they'd left in mid-thought. Some of the cars were burned. Some were intact but empty. Some had streaks on the inside of the windows that I didn't want to identify too precisely. The infected had changed the map. Not the physical roads, they were still asphalt and paint, but the meaning of every structure and bottleneck. A gas station was no longer a place to refuel. It was a place where desperate people gathered and desperate things followed. An overpass wasn't just concrete, it was a shooting platform. A traffic jam wasn't a delay, it was a wall. We were approaching a gentle curve with a stand of trees on the right and a wide shoulder on the left that ran into a shallow ditch. My truck was a standard cargo platform, high enough that you felt every gust, heavy enough that you could push through smaller obstacles if you had to. My hands were at 10 and 2, knuckles pale, eyes scanning the road ahead and the tree line like I could will threats into showing themselves early. Reyes called out, "Checkpoint ahead should be deserted. Stay center lane. Do not stop. If you see personnel, verify." "Copy," I said. The checkpoint was what used to be a state trooper traffic point. Portable barricades and cones. A small digital sign trailer that once flashed amber alerts and weather warnings. Now it sat dark. The sign face cracked, cones scattered as if someone had driven through in a panic. A patrol car was parked diagonally with its driver's side door open. We should have rolled through and left it behind. Instead, as my front bumper crossed an invisible line in the asphalt, my world detonated into motion. The first shots weren't aimed at me, they were aimed at Reyes's Humvee. A sharp crack echoed off the trees, then another. The lead Humvee's windshield spiderwebbed. I saw the gunner flinch. Reyes's brake lights flashed once, just a tap. Then she forced it forward, muscle memory fighting instinct. "Contact, contact," someone shouted over the radio. The convoy erupted into controlled chaos, not screaming, not panic. The kind of practiced response you only get if people have trained for a nightmare long before it arrived. I leaned forward, put off the accelerator just enough to keep spacing without rear-ending the Humvee. My eyes went to the right side tree line. Movement, low and fast, between trunks, more cracks, the sound of rounds snapping past, slapping metal, punching holes in composite. One round pinged off my side mirror with a hard metallic ring that made my stomach lurch. Then the ambush properly revealed itself. Figures in uniforms stepped from cover like they'd rehearsed the timing. Not civilians in stolen gear, not random looters in camouflage. Actual military uniforms, mud-stained, torn, and hanging wrong on bodies that moved with a jerky efficiency. They fired in pairs. They changed positions. One pointed and another moved. They were using hand signals. My brain tried to reject what it was seeing. Infected were supposed to be chaotic, loud, swarming. Not this. Not bounding forward, covering each other, focusing fire on the vehicles with the guns. Those are... Doc's voice cut in, then broke off as if he didn't know how to finish the sentence. Reyes did. Do not let them stop us. Push through. Gunners engage threats to the flank. The gunner on Reyes's Humvee swung the mounted weapon toward the right and fired short bursts, controlled, aimed, not spraying. The sound was heavy, mechanical, familiar. Dust kicked up along the tree line. A uniformed figure stumbled, recovered, and kept moving. Recovered. That was the part that turned my mouth dry. They weren't moving like targets at a range. They were moving like fighters. I heard the enemy voice again, faint, as if transmitted from a handheld close by, bleeding into our net. Take the second truck. Container is second element. Disable, don't burn it. Disable, don't burn it. They knew. A vehicle lurched out from the left shoulder. An old pickup, tan paint, civilian plates, accelerating hard, trying to cut between me and the Humvee ahead. It wasn't random, it was time to force a separation, to split the convoy like a wedge. "Vehicle left," I shouted, not sure anyone heard. Reyes's Humvee swerved slightly, just enough to deny the gap. The pickup clipped the rear corner of her vehicle and fishtailed, tires screaming. It spun out and slammed into the ditch, nose down. The driver didn't climb out. Two uniformed figures jogged to it, one kneeling, one standing guard, and they did something I'll never forget. The kneeling one checked the cab like a casualty assessment, then yanked the door open and pulled the driver free with the efficiency of someone trained in extraction. Except the driver didn't look injured. He looked wrong in a way that made my skin crawl. Head tilted, mouth hanging slightly, eyes fixed on nothing. He moved only when the uniformed figure moved him. The uniformed figure didn't hesitate. He shoved the driver toward the road, toward us, like a tool. The driver stumbled forward, arms loose, then suddenly surged with animal speed the moment he was in the lane, as if some switch flipped. Runner," someone yelled. Reyes's gunner dropped him with a short burst. The body hit hard and slid. Then it tried to get up. It didn't make it. Another controlled burst and it stayed down. I felt my throat tighten. I wanted to call it what it was, but I didn't want the word on the radio. Words have power. And on a day like this, even saying the wrong thing felt like inviting it closer. We powered through the choke point, but the ambush wasn't done. It was built in layers. A second volley came from the left now, from behind the abandoned patrol car and the sign trailer. More uniformed figures, one with a radio handset, another with what looked like an old rifle held correctly. Stock seated, cheek weld, muzzle steady. A round struck the rear of Reyes's Humvee and sparked off metal. Another punched through my truck's side panel with a hollow, awful thunk, and I felt the air change inside the cab like someone had opened a door. I didn't look down. I didn't want to see if it had hit anything that mattered. Reyes's voice snapped. "Rourke, maintain speed. If we stop, we die. Rear element report." Static, a half-second of dead air. Then the rear gun truck came through, strained. Rear MRAP hit, still mobile. "We got..." A burst of gunfire cut him off. And under it all, faint but clear, that enemy voice again, like a ghost with command authority. "Push them into the bend, block with the bus, take the container." A bus? My eyes flicked ahead just as the highway curved and opened into a wider stretch. And there it was. A school bus, yellow paint dulled by dust, angled across the lanes like a barricade. It hadn't been there on our route brief. It wasn't an accident. Someone had moved it. They'd built a wall out of a bus. Reyes saw it too. All stations, obstacle ahead. Prepare to breach. Gunners clear windows. Do not stop. There are moments where training turns into instinct and instinct turns into survival math. A school bus is heavy. My truck was heavy. If I hit it wrong, I'd wedge the convoy in place. If I tried to go around, the shoulder might not hold. If I stopped, I'd become a stationary target and everything behind me would stack up like dominoes. I took a breath that tasted like hot plastic and dust. My dad taught me how to drive in ice and how to recover a skid, but he also taught me something else. Big trucks don't do subtle. Big trucks do commitment. I keyed the mic once, quick. I can push it. Reyes didn't hesitate. Do it. I centered my hood on the bus's rear quarter, not the middle. You don't want to hit the strongest part head on if you can help it. You want to rotate it, break its angle, create a lane. My foot went down. The engine note climbed. My hands locked steady, arms rigid. The bus grew in the windshield like a wall. In the last second, I saw movement inside the bus. Shapes behind glass. Not seated kids. Standing figures, clustered, pressed toward windows. The impact was like hitting a building. Metal shrieked. My chest slammed against the harness. The windshield rattled in its frame. The front of my truck bucked and then shoved forward as inertia did its job. The bus moved. Not easily, not gracefully, but it moved, pivoting on its front wheels, scraping across asphalt with a sound like tearing sheet metal. The glass along the bus's side shattered outward as something inside surged. Hands, arms, faces. Not faces in the normal sense. Faces with slack mouths and eyes that didn't blink, pressed against broken windows as they spilled out. I forced my eyes away and kept pushing until the bus's rear swung enough to open a gap wide enough for a Humvee to squeeze through. Reyes's vehicle shot through first, gunner firing into the bus windows to keep anything from spilling directly into our lane. The second Humvee followed, then the flatbed with the sealed container. The driver white-knuckled, eyes fixed ahead like he was staring through hell at a single point of light. I eased off, letting the bus settle as I steered into the gap. That's when the real strike hit. A uniformed figure stepped out from behind the bus's front end at close range, raised his weapon and fired straight at my cab. I saw the muzzle flash. I saw the sights aligned. I saw how calm he looked. The round slammed into my windshield at the lower left, cracking the glass. Another hit the engine compartment. The engine coughed once, hard. I felt the truck shudder like an animal taking a wound. No, I muttered, as if the machine could hear me. The oil pressure light flickered. My truck still moved, but the engine note turned ragged, uneven. I glanced at the dash cam again without meaning to. It was still recording. It had captured the uniformed figure's face for a half-second, close enough to see details. He had a name tape on his chest. Not that I could read it at speed, but it was there. A name tape, like he'd been someone's teammate. My blood went cold. I didn't have time to process it because my truck was now the slowest thing in the convoy, and slow meant vulnerable. "Rourke, you still moving?" Reyes snapped. "Moving," I said, voice tight. "Took hits. Engine's not happy." "Keep it alive," she said. "You drop, we lose the lane." Behind me, the bus shifted again as something climbed over metal. Shadows moved in the rearview mirror. Figures sprinting, not shambling. They didn't chase like a mob. They chased like a team trying to close distance. One of them raised a hand, pointed, and two others peeled off to the shoulder, angling to get ahead of me. I was tactical. I was a flanking maneuver. My mouth went dry again. "They're trying to pass on the left," I said. "I see it," Reyes answered. "Gunners, left side." The gunner on the second Humvee rotated and fired controlled bursts. One of the flanking figures went down hard. The other slid behind an abandoned sedan, then popped up on the other side like he understood cover. He fired again, aiming at tires. I heard the sharp pop and felt my truck lurch as something struck rubber. The steering wheel tugged in my hands. "Rear tire!" I barked, more to myself than anyone. The convoy had already stretched. Reyes was pulling distance to get the biohazard container clear. The rear MRAP was somewhere behind, dealing with whatever had surged from the bus. I was in the worst place you can be in an ambush, alone in the middle. Doc's voice came through, steadier now. "Mason, listen to me. Don't look at them. Look at the road. Drive the truck." "I'm driving," I said through clenched teeth. The truck's right rear corner started to feel soft, as if the tire had lost pressure. It wasn't blown apart, not yet, but it was bleeding air. A slow failure. A countdown. Highway 74 dipped and rose ahead, tree line tight. I needed open space, a shoulder wide enough to ditch the truck without blocking everyone else. I needed anything that wasn't here. Reyes came on again, voice lower, controlled. "Next intersection is a service road. If you can't keep speed, peel off and meet at Rally Point Delta. Coordinates sent to your GPS." Our military GPS units had been spotty, but my civilian dashboard navigation still worked in places, feeding off cached maps. "Copy," I said. "I'll try to hold." The enemy voice cut in again, closer now, almost overlapping mine. "Disable the lead cargo. Driver's wounded. Take him alive. Take him alive." They were talking about me like I was an item on a checklist. I felt a surge of anger so clean and sharp it almost steadied my hands. Not fear, not panic. Anger at being hunted, at being understood by something that shouldn't understand anything anymore. I shoved the throttle down harder. The engine coughed, then caught, as if offended that I doubted it. We crested a rise and saw a small overpass ahead, just a county road crossing above. On the bridge, silhouettes. Not a crowd, not random shapes. 4 figures, spaced out. One prone, one kneeling, 2 standing. A firing line. I didn't have time to warn anyone. Reyes was already past it, or nearly. I was the one under the bridge at the wrong moment. The prone figure fired first. The round hit my hood and skipped, sparking. Then the kneeling figure fired and my windshield took another crack. The cab filled with the smell of hot glass and something metallic. I ducked without thinking, shoulders up, chin down, trying to make myself smaller behind the wheel. Doc came through with a roar. "Bridge! Bridge!" As if I hadn't noticed. The overpass shooters didn't just fire and vanish, they moved. One pointed toward the side road, like they wanted to funnel me off the highway. It clicked in my head. The bus was to slow the convoy. The ambush fire was to damage vehicles and spread us out. The overpass was to finish the job and force a capture. They were building a trap like it was a training exercise. And the infected were wearing the roles. My right rear tire finally gave up. The truck dropped on that corner, the rim biting asphalt. The steering went heavy and pulled, and my truck started to yaw towards the shoulder. I fought it, arms straining, trying to keep from jackknifing. The shoulder widened near the service road intersection Reyes had mentioned, a gravel spur that ran parallel to the highway through a strip of trees. I made the decision in a fraction of a second because that's all you get. I turned off Highway 74. Gravel rattled like gunfire beneath the chassis. The truck bounced hard, suspension protesting. The tree line closed in, branches slapping the sides. The overpass shooters were behind me now, But I didn't feel relief, only the sick certainty that they wanted me here. My radio crackled with Reyes. "Rourke, report." "I peeled off," I said, breath tight. "Tire's gone. I'm on the service road." A pause, then, "Proceed to Delta. Do not stop for anything. Do you copy?" I copied. But as I pushed the damaged truck along the service road on a dying tire and a wounded engine, I realized something worse. The radio interference wasn't fading. It was following. And when the enemy voice returned, it wasn't on the edge of static anymore. It was crisp, confident, and close enough that I could imagine the speaker's breath on the microphone. "Convoy elements separated. Execute containment. Don't let the sample leave the area." Sample, not cargo. Not container. Sample. They knew exactly what mattered. My dash cam's red light kept blinking, recording the shaking road, the rattling cab, the narrowing strip of trees. If I made it out, that footage would matter. It would prove something Command didn't want to believe. That this wasn't just a sickness. It was something that had learned to wear us like a uniform and use what it remembered. I drove faster anyway because in that moment, the only plan I had was motion. And on the service road around the next bend, I saw the second trap waiting for me. A Humvee, military green, parked sideways across the gravel like a gate. And standing beside it, 3 soldiers in full kit, helmets, vests, rifles. They were facing me, watching me approach. One of them raised a hand and made a signal. "Stop." Only his hand didn't move like a living person's. It moved like a command gesture. And behind the visor, his head tilted as if listening to instructions only he could hear. I couldn't slow down. If I stopped, I'd be swarmed, pulled from the cab, and used like the pickup driver back at the ditch, an object. My choices narrowed to 2 ugly options: ram the Humvee or try to bail into the trees and abandon the truck. I had a wounded engine and 1 dead tire. Ramming might stop me cold. Bailing meant leaving the truck and everything in it: fuel, water, tools. It meant entering the woods with whatever I could grab and whatever was in my pockets. It meant becoming a running man. I put my left hand on the steering wheel, my right on the door handle, and I did the only thing I could think to do with the time I had. I hit the horn. A long, blaring, desperate sound. Not tactical, not professional. Human. The 3 soldiers didn't flinch at the noise, but something else did. From the tree line to the right, shapes shifted. More infected, some in civilian clothes, some in torn uniforms, turned toward the sound like it had pulled a string in their heads. If the uniformed ones were hunting me with procedure, the others were drawn by instinct. I had just lit a signal flare. "Sorry," I whispered to nobody, then aimed at the Humvee's front corner and committed. The truck slammed into the Humvee with a crunch of metal and a jolt that punched the air from my lungs. The Humvee skidded sideways, tires digging into gravel. My truck's hood crumpled. The engine screamed, then stuttered. The soldiers beside the Humvee raised their rifles. But they didn't fire immediately. They stepped back, disciplined, creating space, like they expected me to stop and be trapped. Instead, I shoved the truck through the gap I'd created, scraping past the Humvee's bumper so close I heard metal squeal along metal. The engine died the instant I cleared it. The cab went silent except for the crunch of gravel under momentum. The truck rolled another 20 yards, slowing, then stopped at a crooked angle between trees. I sat there for half a second, hands still on the wheel, chest heaving. Then I heard footsteps. Not shuffling, running. I grabbed my rifle from the rack beside my seat, standard issue, familiar weight, and checked the safety without looking. I snatched my water bottle, shoved my phone into my pocket, and yanked the dash cam from its mount by brute force, the cable snapping free. The camera's red light blinked in my palm. Proof. I kicked the door open and dropped from the cab into gravel, landing hard on my ankle but not caring. Pain was a later problem. I ran toward the trees on the right because that's where the thickest cover was and because the left side had open gravel and no hiding. Behind me, a voice shouted. Not a scream. A command. Driver dismounting. Track right. 2 pursue, 1 hold. I didn't turn around, but the words hit me like a punch. They were calling out my movement. They were directing pursuit. And they were doing it in the voice of someone who had done this before. Someone who had worn a uniform and trained young troops on how to hunt, how to cut off, how to capture. The woods swallowed me in a rush of pine needles, low branches, and shadows. I ducked under a limb, snapped a twig, kept moving. My breath was loud in my own ears. My boots slid on the loose soil. I heard the infected behind me enter the trees. They didn't crash through blindly. They spread out. They were spacing themselves. I forced myself to slow just enough to listen, because running in a straight line is how prey dies. I moved diagonally, putting trees between me and the service road, and I headed toward a low dip where the ground fell into a shallow creek bed. Water means tracks, but water also means noise cover. It means a line that can confuse someone who's tracking by sight. I dropped into the creek bed and splashed once, then stepped carefully, placing my feet on stones and mud edges. I kept the dash cam in my jacket, the rifle low, muzzle forward. A branch cracked behind me, 2 directions, not one. They'd split. I took another step, then froze. A figure stood ahead in the creek bed, half-shadowed, uniform hanging loose, helmet tilted. He held a rifle at low ready like he'd been taught. He looked at me. And for one impossible moment I saw something like recognition in his face. Not warmth, not empathy, but the faint mechanical, I know what you are, that you see in a working dog or a security guard scanning badges. He raised his rifle. I didn't aim for his head. I didn't think in those terms. I thought in terms of stopping a threat fast enough to not be surrounded. I fired a controlled pair at center mass like I'd been trained, the recoil punching my shoulder. He staggered, dropped to one knee, and for a second I thought it worked. Then he started to rise again. His hands were shaking, but he was getting up. My stomach lurched. Whatever this infection was, it didn't just change behavior, it changed the rules. I fired again, not in panic, but in grim necessity until he finally collapsed and didn't move. The silence afterward was worse than the gunshot. It felt like I'd rung a bell. From behind me, the enemy voice called again, closer now. And it wasn't on the radio this time. It was in the woods. Contact, he's in the creek bed, move to encircle. They were close enough to see me, close enough to hear my breathing. I ran. I ran down the creek bed until it bent and climbed out the far side, using roots like rungs. I pushed through brush, scraped my cheek on a branch, and nearly fell into a patch of briars. I didn't know where Delta was anymore. My truck had been my compass. The road had been my guide. Now, I had trees and fear, and a mental map drawn from a quick glance at Reyes's route brief. Somewhere west, there was a rally point. Somewhere west, my convoy was still moving with the biohazard container. Somewhere west, people were still trying to pretend there was a command structure holding the line. But here, in these woods off Highway 74, I was a separated element, exactly what the enemy wanted. I forced myself to stop behind a fallen log and crouched, back pressed to bark, rifle up. I listened. Footsteps. Controlled, a pause, a rustle, another step. They weren't rushing me. They weren't swarming. They were hunting me. And then, from somewhere to my left, I heard something that made my blood go colder than it had any right to be. A whistle. 2 short bursts. A hand signal you use when you're trying to move people quietly without radios. I answered with silence because I wasn't on their team. But the woods answered for me. A chorus of distant moans. Low, hungry sounds. Shifted direction and started moving toward the whistle like gravity had changed. The procedural infected had just used the wild ones like a weapon. I realized right then what we were dealing with. This wasn't just infected people who happened to be wearing uniforms. This was a mixed threat. Some driven by raw instinct, some retaining enough structure to command, coordinate, and exploit every sound and bottleneck. A broken world's worst possible combination. My radio crackled softly in my ear, as if it had waited for me to understand before it spoke. "Mason," Reyes said, voice tense. "Where are you?" I swallowed, throat dry. "In the woods, off the service road. Truck is disabled." A pause, then quieter. "Are you alive?" "I'm alive." "Listen," she said, "we can't come back. We have the container moving. They hit us hard. We lost 1 vehicle." Her words landed like stones. Lost 1 vehicle. That meant people. That meant someone's seat was empty and would stay empty. "I understand," I said, though it tasted like ash. "We are rerouting," she continued. "They set multiple traps. They're not normal. Priya says—" She broke off, then came back with control. "Priya says the infection isn't wiping training. It's preserving pieces." "I know," I said, looking through trees that suddenly felt too thin to protect me. "They're using hand signals." Silence on the radio for a beat. Then Reyes, "You need to get to Delta on foot. Doc will talk you in. Keep comms brief. If you can, bring your dash cam. Command needs proof." I looked down at the camera tucked in my jacket. The red light still blinked. "Copy," I said. "Delta is near a cleared area," Reyes added. "Old gravel pit, north of the highway. If you can get eyes on a power line cut, follow it. It leads close." I pictured the map. Power lines. Easement cuts through woods. Straight lines in a world of curves. "Copy," I said again. Doc came on, voice softer, like he was speaking directly into my head. "Mason, you're going to do this 1 step at a time. Don't sprint unless you have to. Water when you can. Check your ankles, and don't let them talk you into stopping." "Talk me into stopping?" I asked. Doc didn't answer immediately. Then he did, and his voice had a brittle edge. "We heard them on the net. They were calling your name." My skin prickled. "That's not possible." "Your name," he repeated. "Or something close. They had your last name. We don't know how." I stared at the trees, suddenly aware of how many places a person could hide, how many eyes could be watching, how many mouths could form words. If they could call my name, they could do more than hunt with whistles. They could bait. "Doc," I said carefully, "if you hear me calling, and it doesn't make sense, don't answer." A pause. Then, "Same to you." I moved again, slower now, using cover, stepping over logs instead of crashing through brush. I angled north, looking for the straight, unnatural scar of a power line cut. I kept my rifle ready but not waving. Muzzle discipline still mattered, even in the woods, even alone. Old rules can keep you alive when new rules are trying to kill you. After 10 minutes, maybe 15, time had turned slippery. I saw it. A wide corridor through the trees, a strip of low grass and scrub under tall wooden poles and sagging lines. The power was likely gone, but the corridor remained like a path cut by a giant blade. I stepped into it and immediately felt exposed. The easement was open. If someone was watching from the tree line, I was a silhouette. but it was also fast, straight, a guide. I moved along the edge, keeping one foot in the brush, one in the open, so I could duck back if needed. The ground was uneven, littered with old utility markers and discarded metal. Somewhere in the distance, I heard the faint crack of gunfire, short bursts, likely the convoy still fighting its way out. I forced myself not to imagine who was still in those vehicles. My radio stayed quiet except for occasional clicks as Reyes checked in with other elements. When she spoke, her words were stripped down to essentials. A convoy voice, professional even when the world wasn't. As I walked, I kept thinking about the first thing I'd heard, the enemy voice on our net, the language, the confidence, the way it had prioritized the container and issued instructions like a squad leader. If those partially cognitive infected were former soldiers, they weren't just dangerous because they could shoot. They were dangerous because they could plan. And planning meant there would be more than one ambush. I reached a point where the power line cut crossed a narrow paved road, one of those rural connectors that runs between small towns and back entrances to nowhere. A car sat abandoned in the middle, doors open, luggage spilled, as if someone had tried to pack their whole life into the trunk and then changed their mind halfway through. I paused behind a pole and listened. Nothing close. I crossed quickly, staying low. On the far side, the corridor climbed slightly, and through the thinning trees I saw a change in the landscape, a break that looked like open ground. A gravel pit. Delta. Relief hit me so hard I almost stumbled. I didn't run though, I walked faster, controlled, because the moment you assume safety is usually the moment you get punished. As I approached the edge, I saw movement in the pit. Figures in camouflage behind berms, rifles pointed outward, a defensive position, real soldiers, not the wrong kind. A voice boomed, amplified by the open space. "Hold, identify." I raised my left hand slowly, rifle held in my right, muzzle down. "Mason Rourke, North Carolina Guard," I shouted. Separated from convoy, friendly. "Approach slowly," the voice commanded, hands visible. I stepped forward, heart hammering, and as I did I saw the soldiers' faces, drawn, exhausted, eyes too sharp. They'd been fighting for days. They'd learned the hard way not to trust anything that moved. I was halfway down the slope into the pit when my radio crackled with Doc's voice, urgent. "Mason, behind you." I spun. At the edge of the tree line along the power line cut, 3 figures stood watching. Military uniforms. Helmets. Rifles. They weren't rushing. They weren't charging. They were standing like instructors at a range, observing. One of them raised a hand and made a small gesture. And from the woods behind them, shadows began to move. More infected, drawn by whistles and sound, turning towards the open pit like water flowing downhill. The partially cognitive ones weren't here to charge the position head-on. They were here to direct the rest, to flood the pit, to make us waste ammunition, exhaust ourselves, and then, when we were pinned and depleted, move in for the sample they believed we had. I realized something with a cold clarity. They didn't know the convoy had escaped with the sealed container. They thought I still had it. I was the decoy they'd created by damaging my truck and forcing me off route. And now, standing on the lip of Delta, I had 2 seconds to decide whether to tell the soldiers the truth, or whether the truth would get all of us overrun. I turned back to the defenders and shouted, "They're using the others like a wave. Don't waste fire on the front. Watch the edges, watch the uniforms." The soldiers reacted instantly, shifting positions, calling targets, moving like professionals. Somebody swung a heavy weapon toward the tree line. Another soldier threw a smoke canister, white plume blooming, obscuring sight lines. A squad leader, staff sergeant by his stripes, grabbed my shoulder and yanked me down behind a berm. His breath smelled like coffee gone cold and adrenaline. "You said separated from Convoy," he snapped. "Where's the container?" "Not with me," I said fast. "Convoy pushed through. I'm just the driver who got peeled off." His eyes narrowed. "Then why are they here?" I swallowed. "Because they think I have it, and because some of them still remember how to fight." In the smoke, shapes moved at the tree line. The uniformed infected didn't fire yet. They watched, directing with gestures. The non-uniform infected began to spill out, staggering, then surging, drawn by sound and the promise of bodies. The staff sergeant cursed under his breath and keyed his radio, voice clipped. "All stations, execute perimeter plan. Prioritize the uniformed threats. Do not let them get close enough to use the crowd as cover." He looked at me again. "Name?" "Rourke." "You got ammo?" "3 magazines," I said, "and a dash cam with footage." His jaw tightened. "Good, you're staying. You're part of this now." Part of this. Like there was still an us big enough to hold the line. Over the berm, the first wave hit the gravel pit's edge, and the defenders opened fire in disciplined bursts, short, controlled, aimed. The smoke rolled, the air filled with dust and the sharp crack of rifles. Through it all, on the far edge, I saw one of the uniformed infected raise a handheld radio and speak, calm as a training NCO. And even though I couldn't hear the words over the gunfire, I could see the intent in his posture. He was calling the next move, because this wasn't a single ambush anymore. It was a campaign, and Highway 74 was just the first lesson. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe. Your support keeps these creepypastas coming. Until next time, stay alert, stay safe, and never ignore the feeling that something is watching.